Ladies and gentlemen, dear students, friends of contemporary literature, please join me in welcoming Morgan Jerkins, our tonight's speaker. From the applause we can hear, she is a world-famous author, journalist, editor, filmmaker, and professor of creative writing at Princeton. Please also join me in welcoming Wiebke Puls, actress in the ensemble of the Kammerspiele here in Munich and known from various other activities, films, movies, and so forth. Welcome to Professor Claudia Olk, who holds the chair of English literature at LMU Munich and initiated the Erika Mann Lecture series. Thank you so much for that. And then, thanks to the representatives of the cooperation partners of this event, Friederike Busch from Holzbrink, Berlin, Dr. Michael Ott, from the Cultural Department of the City of Munich. Nicola, no, she's not coming, I heard, but Anke Büttner is here, Director of Monazensia im Hildebrandhaus, also here in Munich. There are also various other important persons here. The Dean of the Faculty of Literature, Languages and Literature, Herr Schmidt, Herr Mehltretter, whom I'm seeing here, has been Dean of that faculty. So I'm very glad that all these peoples have come. Welcome to all guests and members of the LMU, and from outside of LMU, this is also a Munich event. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this third Erika Mann Lecture 2025. 2025 marks the 150th birthday of Thomas Mann, but tonight we dedicate this evening to his daughter, Erika Mann, a well-known writer in her own right. As I said, this evening marks the third edition of the Erika Mann Lecture series. It was launched in 2023 with Asal Dardan and continued in 2024 with journalist and writer Caroline Imke. The Erika Mann Lecture is a joint initiative of LMU Munich, Rowohlt Verlag and Holzbrink in Berlin, and in cooperation with Monazensia at the Hildebrandhaus and the Cultural Department of the City of Munich. Its aim is twofold: to foster interdisciplinary dialogue across the university and to serve as a window between academia and the broader public. Each year, the lecture addresses important societal issues in ways that resonate far beyond the university setting. Tonight's speaker, Morgan Jerkins, exemplifies this mission as a public intellectual through her novels, her journalistic and essayistic work, her films, and her teaching as professor of creative writing at Princeton. She powerfully embodies the spirit of this Erika Mann Lecture. We are also delighted that Morgan Jerkins will... Sorry, I made a mistake. Morgan Jerkins will hold a student workshop tomorrow at the Monazensia, a rare opportunity that was booked out in no time and even has a waiting list now, as I have heard. To those lucky enough to have secured a spot, enjoy what it promises to be a valuable and inspiring experience. I wish us all an inspiring and thought-provoking evening. And now I'm pleased to hand over to Professor Claudia Olk, who will introduce tonight's speaker with much more competence than I'm able to. Thank you. I would also like to thank the two musicians for having come here. We have heard you once, and I know we will hear you several times. It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Hey everybody, good evening. Welcome, dear Morgan Jerkins, dear Wiebke Puls, sehr geehrter Herr Vizepräsident van S, Spektabilitäten, liebe Kommilitoninnen und Kommilitonen, distinguished guests, dear ladies and gentlemen. It is my great privilege to welcome you on behalf of our faculty, Dean Schmidt, our board, and our partner, Holzbrink Berlin, to this third Erika Mann Lecture. I thank you all for the commitment that brought you here today and for all that it means and sustains. Over the past 3 years, many individuals and institutions have supported us, and I shall gratefully like to acknowledge their immense help, which continues to be crucial to this lecture series. My special thanks goes to my university, LMU Munich. I thank our faculty, Dean Schmidt and Hanno Scherer, for their continuous and unbureaucratic support. A huge thank you to Rowohlt Publishing House, and thank you to our friends and collaborators from the Monazensia, Frau Büttner and Frau Faber, Michael Ott from the Cultural Office at the Munich City Hall. The Erika Mann Lecture is a team effort, and I would like to thank my co-workers here in Munich, Nicolina Hatton, Kurt Kasper, Lara Ehrenfried, Tim Sommer, Helena Dalmau-Felderhoff, Henrike Hörlein-Krause, Salome Klatt, Flora Tucker, you will meet them today, Sophie Rudemann, Victoria Eisen, Natalia Drescher, and Petra Hustad for her dedication, without which we would not be here today. Let me now briefly introduce today's speaker, Morgan Jerkins, who came all the way from New York City yesterday to give today's lecture. Morgan Jerkins has published 4 books. Alongside her writings for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Vanity Fair. She has had a New York Times bestseller, holds 2 National Magazine Awards, and has been one of Forbes 30 under 30. She has taught at Princeton and Columbia, as well as the Pacific University and the New School. Aside from her writing, teaching, and editing careers in the US, she is no stranger to Germany and held a Picador guest professorship at Leipzig University. Morgan Jerkins grew up in New Jersey and obtained a BA from Princeton University, where she studied comparative literature. She graduated speaking 5 languages: English, Russian, Japanese, Portuguese, French, and Spanish. Yet, despite her impressive curriculum vitae, Jerkins also struggled to break into New York's predominantly white publishing scene. Applying her personal mantra, "You may not be the best writer, but you're going to work harder than the best writer," she established herself as fast and reliable and became sought after by editors. True to her motto, she wrote her first book, This Will Be My Undoing, living at the intersection of Black, female, and feminist in white America, which soon became a New York Times bestseller. The book stands out for its candor and its vulnerability, traits she carries on into her second book, Wandering in Strange Lands, which traced Jerkins's family history through 300 years. Indeed, we must also consider Jerkins as a literary archivist. Fittingly, her new novel, Zeal, begins with a historical document, a letter written in 1863 from an enslaved man, James Tate, to his wife, Olivia, who is enslaved on a different plantation. James tells Olivia that his master has urged him to move on and forget her. He writes that he will not. Combining romance and historic epic, Zeal was Time and Publishers Weekly most anticipated novel. The Boston Globe praised the novel's meticulous historiography, the recreation of history, and called it cinematic and a page-turner. And yet, for Jerkins too, the threat of censorship looms large. As the current US administration seeks to undermine America's racial history under the guise of, in their jargon, improper ideology, Jerkins remains indomitable, recalling, "My body is a living historical document." In a similar vein, James Baldwin wrote, "History is present in all that we do." And indeed, reading Morgan Jerkins encourages us to ask questions such as, what would have been the feeling to be told you have no culture, you have no heritage, your people had created nothing meaningful, and then to be united and uplifted by a different story, a new story of your past that becomes the new narrative of what is possible. History not only tells us that things were once different than we experience them now, it tells us that they can and they will be different again. And perhaps most importantly, it tells us that we can make it so. In today's unsettling political climate, when self-absorption threatens to undermine our responsibility towards others, when the character attributes of honesty, sincerity, and curiosity are all too easily trumped by mendacity, deceit, and entitled ignorance, authors like you, dear Morgan, so powerfully remind us that education and freedom are inseparably intertwined. Learning instills agency. It gives us perspective as a passport to other times, other places, and other points of view as well, as a way to learn about ourselves, to reimagine our lives in ways that alter us forever. The Erika Mann Lecture, hence, is meant to encourage us to think about the bigger picture, to use our historical imagination to look beyond the here and now, and it reminds us that we are entrusted with the past and responsible for the future. Universities are accountable to the past and to the future, and they create a space of freedom. Advancing the critical role of education is crucial to promoting service, achieving social justice, enhancing understanding, and widening opportunity. Following the example of Erika Mann, we are committed to protecting this space of freedom, to continue to insist and demonstrate that facts and knowledge matter, and to further enhancing our close ties with many individuals and institutions around the world. We are therefore very grateful to you, dear Morgan, for speaking to us today. Before your lecture, now we will hear texts by Erika Mann recited by Wiebke Puls. Thank you for having been part of the Erika Mann Lecture series from the beginning. After the last piece of music by Johannes König and Pedro Aguiar, following the lecture, we would like to invite you to a small reception outside, and there will also be a book stand where you can buy some of Morgan's books and also have them signed. But first of all, I now wish us all an inspiring evening. Thank you very much.
Erika Mann, ausgerechnet ich, aus Blitze überm Ozean. Es ist etwas paradox, dass meine persönliche Geschichte sich vor allem mit Politik befassen wird, obwohl die Politik keinesfalls mein Hauptinteresse ist. Ich habe nie irgendeiner politischen Partei angehört, noch habe ich mich je um die spitzfindigen Argumente und zwielichtigen Intrigen von Berufspolitikern gekümmert. Meine Sicht der entscheidenden Themen der modernen Gesellschaft ist eher emotional als intellektuell. Nicht dogmatisch, sondern menschlich. Ich bin weder eine Partisanin, noch würde ich zum Kreuzfahrer taugen. Meine politischen Ansichten und Handlungen sind stets mehr von meinen persönlichen Erfahrungen und Impulsen als von abstrakten Prinzipien bestimmt worden. Das einzige Prinzip, an das ich mich halte, ist mein hartnäckiger Glaube an einige grundlegende moralische Ideale: Wahrheit, Ehre, Anstand, Freiheit, Toleranz. Das mag wie ein ziemlich kindisches Credo klingen. Aber sind sich Kinder nicht instinktiv gewisser moralischer Grundsätze bewusst, die ihre Gültigkeit und ihre Überzeugungskraft für viele Erwachsene verloren haben? Kinder wissen, was schwarz und was weiß ist, Sie unterscheiden zwischen Gut und Böse. Kinder haben ein klareres ethisches Bewusstsein und sie sind oft intelligenter als unsere hartgesottenen Skeptiker und Realisten. Ich glaube, dass Idealismus nicht nur schöner, sondern im Ergebnis auch realistischer als jeder schlaue, zynische Realismus ist. Indem die sogenannten Realisten solche einfachen Ideen wie Gut und Böse, Anstand und Verbrechen ignorieren, sind sie bereit, mit dem Teufel Geschäfte zu machen, der sie natürlich erst recht überlisten und betrügen wird. Realisten meinen, es sei klug, ihre Nachbarn nicht gegen die Aggression böser Mächte zu verteidigen. Wie dumm die Realisten sind. Ihre schlauen Tricks funktionieren nicht. Ihre Politik des Appeasement, der Zweckmäßigkeit, des Isolationismus scheitert am Ende immer, unvermeidlich und verheerend. Das Böse kann nicht beschwichtigt werden. Es muss bekämpft und vernichtet werden. Dieser fundamentale Grundsatz, dass Zynismus sich nicht auszahlt und Idealismus resolut, kompromisslos, sogar militant sein muss, damit er nicht untergeht, wird das Hauptthema, der Leitgedanke meiner Geschichte sein. Ich werde versuchen, diesen Gedanken zu beweisen und zu veranschaulichen, indem ich einfach meine persönlichen Erfahrungen und die einiger meiner Mitstreiter darstelle. Denn dies war mein einziger Ehrgeiz und meine einzige Beschäftigung während der letzten 10 Jahre, auf meine eigene, bescheidene Weise die Mächte des Bösen zu bekämpfen, am krassesten verkörpert vom finsteren Phänomen des Narzissmus. Dies war meine Arbeit und mein Abenteuer, den Erzfeind zu demaskieren, lächerlich zu machen, anzuklagen und zu verwirren. Die Botschaft, die ich vermitteln wollte, war immer ein direkter, ungeschminkter Appell an die menschliche Solidarität gegen die unmenschlichen Mächte der Dunkelheit und der Zerstörung. Das ist es, was ich in all meinen Schriften und Reden ausdrücken wollte, in meinen Büchern und Zeitungsartikeln, meinen Geschichten für Kinder, meinen Vorträgen und Radioansprachen. Ich sagte es von 100 Theaterbühnen in Europa, als ich den Kontinent mit meinem kleinen Kabarett Die Pfeffermühle bereiste, und ich sagte es von Hunderten von Rednerpulten in den Vereinigten Staaten. Mehr als einmal kam ich wegen meiner kindischen Hartnäckigkeit in Schwierigkeiten. In der Schweiz provozierte ich so etwas wie einen kleinen Bürgerkrieg. In der Tschechoslowakei verteidigten mich die Arbeiter gegen den Nazimob, weil die Polizei es nicht wagte. In Holland wurden meine satirischen Lieder und Sketche der Gegenstand schwerwiegender offizieller Diskussionen und hitziger Kontroversen. Ausgerechnet ich rief zu Aufständen und Auseinandersetzungen auf. Sogar Goebbels wurde nervös und beleidigte mich im Rundfunk. Aber ich verfügte über keinerlei Macht, keine Geheimwaffen, keinen ungewöhnlichen Scharfsinn. Alles, was ich wollte, alles, was ich zu sagen versuchte, offen und einfach, war, was ich für richtig und wahr hielt. Weil ich die Wahrheit sagen wollte, musste ich wissen, was wirklich in der Welt vorgeht. Ich konnte mich nicht auf die Geschichten anderer Leute verlassen, sondern musste es selbst herausfinden. Ich musste herumreisen. Und genau das tat ich. Ich kam ganz schön herum in diesen 10 ereignisreichen Jahren. Oft genug war ich genau am Ort des Geschehens. In Spanien während des Bürgerkriegs, in der Tschechoslowakei während der Münchenkrise, in Großbritannien während der Luftschlacht um England. Natürlich werden all diese Orte, diese Menschen, die ich dort traf und die Geschehnisse, die ich mit ansah, zu einem wesentlichen Teil meiner persönlichen Geschichte. Jede neue Erfahrung, Reisen, Freundschaften, Gefahren und Niederlagen war mir eine neue Lehre oder besser Jedes neue Abenteuer bestätigte, vertiefte und erweiterte eine der Grundwahrheiten, die mich immer geleitet haben. Ich will keine Theorien entwickeln, aber ich will gewisse Rückschlüsse aus dem ziehen, was ich gesehen und durchlebt habe. Ich habe den hässlichen Triumph brutaler Gewalt gesehen und erfahren, den Bankrott diplomatischer Tricks und Konventionen, das Leiden anständiger, irregeleiteter Menschen. Aber ich habe auch das Erwachen der Opfer gesehen, die Rebellion des einfachen Mannes, seine Tapferkeit und grimmige Entschlossenheit. Ich habe den Krieg der Völker gesehen und dahinter, hinter all seinem Schrecken und Stumpfsinn, die gewaltige Verheißung eines Friedens für die Völker der Erde.
Good? Can you hear me okay? Good evening, everyone. I purposely did not look behind me the whole time because I didn't want to get nervous about how many people were in the audience. So that was a very honest reaction there. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Germany has treated me very well over the years, and even though I flew in yesterday all the way from New York, I'd do it again in a heartbeat because of just the lovely introduction that brought me to tears. It's a kind of welcoming that many authors can dream of. So thank you so much for taking the time. In 1698, there was a man who was born in the Ethiopian Empire, or modern-day Cameroon. His lineage would change the contours of world literature forever. This man might have been considered in his homeland to be a nobleman because his father reportedly had quite a bit of livestock, several wives, and 19 children. But one day, while this man's father was defending his property and people from being conquered by soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, this proud family fell apart. This man was kidnapped and brought to Constantinople, where he served in Sultan Ahmed III's household for about a year. And then around 1704, a Russian ambassador was looking for a few African slaves to take to the Tsar's palace in Moscow, and our main character landed in Russia. Impressed by this enslaved man's intelligence and military service, this man was brought into Peter the Great's household, baptized in a Russian Orthodox church, and given the name Abram Ganibal. Ganibal is the great-grandfather of Alexander Pushkin, author of Eugene Onegin, and founder of modern Russian literature. I know you're probably thinking from that intro, where is this lady going with this? How is she in Munich and she's speaking about Russia? What does that have to do with anything? I thought about these questions as I was developing this lecture, and I almost abandoned this opening altogether until I remembered that upon accepting this opportunity, I was told by this evening's coordinators that hope should be interwoven into tonight's lecture. Hope, or Nadezhda in Russian, was Pushkin's mother's name. Hope was what I encountered in Pushkin's prose, and even in his face when I was the only Black student in my introductory Russian class 15 years ago. I arrived in a small classroom within a Gothic-style building where I sought to investigate how the prose of someone like Pushkin or Dostoevsky or Bulgakov, all Russian stylists, could penetrate the heart and soul of a young Black American woman like myself, not realizing that we all understood emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually what it meant to exist in the margins. Now, my lineage is a bit more humble. I was born and raised in the southern part of New Jersey, which is about 2 hours outside of New York City. My father is an obstetrician and gynecologist, and my mother is a real estate agent. When I was around 13, my mother remarried an Army veteran and psychologist who we affectionately called Z. It was only 2 years into their marriage that my mother learned that Z was experiencing some cognitive issues. He was forgetting receipts at the grocery store, mixing up names, and pacing in our household in the middle of the night. Ultimately, he was diagnosed with frontal temporal lobe dementia and Alzheimer's, and my mother became his caretaker. As these illnesses were debilitating my stepfather and my mother's livelihood and well-being, I was studying at Princeton University, and my mental health was taking a toll. I could not sleep, and if I did, I would wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing in my chest. I was constantly on edge, emotionally raw, and very lost. But one of my many anchors was literature, late 19th century Russian literature to be exact. I remember going to a dinner in honor of the Department of Comparative Literature, where I heard this scholar named Dr. Carol Emerson read a single scene in 3 different English translations of Eugene Onegin. Visibly awestruck and moved, I approached Dr. Emerson at the end of the dinner and told her that her presentation made me want to learn Russian, to which she passionately said, "Do it." So there I was, Monday through Friday, learning how to conjugate, communicate, and most of all, translate. From the moment I took my first introductory Russian class, I knew I wanted to learn how to speak and read well, because there had to be some inscrutabilities in Russian prose that no English translation could decipher. We'd use poetry and novel excerpts to strengthen our proficiency in the midst of a whirlwind of exams and written work. When finally, towards the end of the semester, I applied for the opportunity to learn intermediate Russian at the Nevsky Institute located in St. Petersburg for the months of June and July. I got in. My dream was to read Russian in the original as part of my foreign language endeavors as a comparative literature major, and I was one step closer to my goal. But one day, I was called into my Russian professor's office and saw him seated at his desk, and then another instructor seated on the opposite side next to an empty chair, presumably where I would have sat. It was silent at first. I thought that I was in trouble. As soon as I took a seat, my professor told me that Russia had the current highest population of neo-Nazis in the world. He never mentioned my identity as a Black woman, and neither did the other instructor. But when he gave me the option to not attend the summer program, perhaps out of fear for my safety, I knew it was because of that. Nevertheless, I still decided that I wanted to go. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I arrived in St. Petersburg on June 1st, 2012. 2012, to make sure I got that right. It was my 20th birthday. I didn't celebrate with dinner or alongside college classmates who'd also got into the program. Instead, I dragged myself up a dark apartment building to a spare room fixed by a single Russian mom and spent hours trying to figure out how to connect to the internet. What I most recall about this stay was not just the scalding hot water or the pelmeni sour cream that the hostess made. I remember the small portrait of Alexander Pushkin that she had mounted on her wall right in the hallway entrance of her home. I was very lonely. I was the only Black person at the Nevsky Institute, where there were not only Russian locals perfecting their English, but also English-speaking ones from America and countries like Scotland, to learn the complexities of authors like Lermontov, conversation and sentence construction. I tried to never walk alone. I kept my head down as I walked to the local train station, even as we passed men studying at the adjacent military academy. And despite all this, I have never experienced such intense stares in my life. But as long as I was spending time seeing the neighborhood that inspired Crime and Punishment, or seeing the room where Dostoevsky wrote The Brothers Karamazov, I found solace. Finding Pushkin was another enlightened discovery for me. I visited his apartment that was turned into a museum, peered down at a lock of hair kept encased in a glass box, his own hair. But when I saw a monument of Pushkin in the center of Art Square, right in front of the Russian Museum, formerly known as Mikhailov Palace, I needed a moment. I scrutinized his features, particularly his face, and I studied the width of his forehead, his jawline, and his curly locks. I took a picture standing directly underneath the monument because it was so large. But what I didn't realize in retrospect is that when I saw him, I saw myself. I didn't feel as alone when I thought of him, and I didn't feel as alone when I thought of my blackness in this magnificent but also treacherous city. I remember the evening so vividly because what transpired has a kind of otherworldly quality to it. Me and my friend, a Mexican-American named Alex, were having an early dinner with a Russian friend who was assigned by the Institute so that the friend could practice her English and we could practice our Russian. Let's call her Natalia. Eventually, we went to a bar with 3 Scottish students who were studying at the same institution. It was a chic, semi-underground place towards the end of Nevsky Prospect, the main thoroughfare of St. Petersburg. I ordered something called a Long Island iced tea, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a combination of cola, sweet and sour mix, and 7 different liquors. Needless to say, I got drunk very quickly. In my haze, I did notice how the rest of our group was making friends with other bilingual, cosmopolitan, and Russian partygoers. These partygoers were very emotionally detached from each other, eschewed romantic labels, and carried themselves with an air of sophistication. They suggested that we go to another bar, and suddenly, 2 of our Scottish friends, 2 women in particular, seemed to have vanished. After a bit of dancing on the dance floor, we collectively decided to go after them because they were attractive female Westerners. They had to be drunk because their Scottish male friend urinated on the side of a building earlier. I still didn't know how he didn't get caught. We turned down the corner to an avenue that was a lot less lit than we were when we first ended up. Much less lit and much quieter. There was a street lamp and some people hanging around outside, and plus, I wasn't so alone, so I figured I should be safe. But then a random stranger pinned me against the wall. He didn't physically touch me, but he has his arms out against the wall at both sides of my head. I felt trapped. I froze. If I said anything in the little Russian I knew, he could physically harm me. If I said nothing, he could also physically harm me. The stranger didn't do anything else because suddenly that Scottish male, who was at least a foot taller than me, grabbed my arm and pulled me out from the confrontation. His maneuver was as smooth as a knife slicing through warm butter. We walked upstairs to what looked like a hole in the wall, me, Alex, Natalia, and the Scottish man. At the top, there was what we call a female bouncer. And when I handed her my license, she asked, "Are you American?" I replied, "Yes." And she replied, "Good luck." At first, I thought perhaps she didn't know the English translation for "have a good time." But I could not shake the feeling that she meant something more ominous. There were a few college-age men dancing drunkenly in the corner. I kept my eye on Alex, who was also very visibly drunk. And despite me having a Long Island iced tea about an hour ago or less, my senses were sharp. Once I returned from the bathroom, I could not find the Scottish man until I turned a corner and saw him about to approach a group of bald-headed white men who were all dressed with jet black t-shirts. The Scottish women who we lost at the bar earlier were sitting in this circle, and the Scottish man went right up to them and stuck up his hand to introduce himself. Now remember, this Scottish man is about a foot taller than me or more, and he's also gay, but presents very masculine. I stood behind him during this introduction, and perhaps that saved me because I was hidden. When the Scottish man tried to introduce himself, one of the bald-headed men said in almost a facetious way, "Do you know what I am? I am a skinhead." Once I heard that, the room fell silent. I immediately grabbed Alex's arm, and it felt like we flew down the flight of stairs. I don't remember my feet touching the ground, and before I could register what just happened, from the bars to dancing to this bar, to even my Russian professor warning me of this danger back at university, Alex was yelling in my face, wondering why I did what I did. Natalia followed behind, visibly shaken. I told Alex to be quiet and follow me, and eventually we wound up sitting inside a sandwich shop. We sat in that sandwich shop till sunrise. Those Scottish women eventually joined us, where they spoke about how those men made them do salutes that would get someone arrested in this country. But I never forgot their dispositions while recounting their experiences. Light, facetious, perhaps even a bit cheery. They did not seem afraid or shaken like I was. They told what happened to them in the manner as if this was another wild, drunken night for them. I was relieved that given the buildup to this climax, they were not physically harmed, but I was not relieved for myself. I knew that when morning arrived, I would get on the subway with only a child's love of Russian, and I hoped I would not run into one of those men, or anyone for that matter, who would do me great harm. Just 4 years before I arrived in Russia, one African American was stabbed. 5 years after me, in 2017, another Black person was stabbed too, but this time the wounds were fatal. I was obsessive and anxious as I took the train to the station where I would get off, and scared for my life again when I had to walk home in the early hours of the morning, and then once again when I had to return to a dark apartment building. I took one look at that Pushkin portrait on the entrance walls of the home where I was staying, got into bed, and a few minutes later, I heard a few knocks, and the host mother said, "Завтрак через несколько минут," or breakfast in a few minutes. I had to register how normal she sounded. Did she know I just arrived home? Did she hear me enter? She had no questions about where I'd been. Maybe she respected my privacy since she had much experience in being a host mother to international students. But in that moment, I felt like my world did not extend beyond the four corners of my bedroom, not only because of my emotional processing, but also for my survival. What saved me during my studies in St. Petersburg was literature. Within the lines of some of the world's greatest literary wordsmiths, my body became limitless, my skin became unimportant, and my world became that much bigger. When I think of what happened to me on that summer evening, sometimes I wrestle myself to really believe that that was reality. As I get older and the years melt away, it's hard for me to reckon with the fact that I didn't just make it up. Perhaps that's how trauma works. Trauma has a way of disrupting your thorough lines of memory, and any harm that was done to you is either reconsidered, justified, or defended. After all, I came back from that night physically unscathed, but psychologically, I'm not sure. It wasn't until I was on my way home back from Russia to the United States on a surprisingly upgraded flight at that, where I met another American who studied there just like myself. We had a long flight, and I told him just a little about my experiences, as feeling as though I were a target, and that every time I stepped outside, I was always being stared at. People, particularly men's gazes, were so fierce and penetrating. He counteracted by telling me that one of his classmates, another black woman, received all of what I said and much, much more. According to that man, this other black woman was not only stared at, but kids would point at her on the street. Some would even call her a monkey. I was horrified by hearing this because the stories reminded me of something from a previous era, Jim Crow, where racial segregation was legal in America. When I finally touched down on American soil, I felt irresolute. I carried more questions than answers in my heart. But what was an anchor for me throughout my entire trip abroad and back into an advanced Russian class in the fall was my love for literature. You see, when it was time for me to declare my major at Princeton and to write my paper during my third year, Dr. Carol Emerson, the one who read those Eugene Onegin translations at that faculty dinner, was now my advisor. What I remembered most fondly about our meetings together was a book that sat prominently on the shelves of her personal library. It was called Under the Sky of My Africa, Alexander Pushkin and Blackness. I found him again. Not etched in stone, not painted on a portrait, he was right there. Instead of me looking up at him in St. Petersburg, he was looking at me in Princeton. In that moment, we didn't seem as two writers of African descent, as positioned on opposite poles of each other. Pushkin, like myself, knew what it was like to be an outsider on the basis of race. When he was only 24, he was exiled because he published a poem called Ode to Liberty, which emphasized human yearning, liberation, and justice. That poem, among his other writings, is said to be romantic. And so I began to wonder, what does it mean to be a romantic? What does it mean for an African-originated soul to label themselves and their prose as such? What does it say about how he sees the world and how the world sees him? First, I needed to investigate. What is a romantic? No, I am not talking about someone who desires another, possesses elaborate fantasies as a couple, and may even romanticize or overemphasize the good qualities about another person to the point of obsession or even delusion. I'm not referring to dates, candlelit dinners, roses, or a happily ever after. I'm referring to a romantic in the literary sense. Well, for starters, the history of the Romantic period was somewhere around 1798 to 1837. Writers were inspired by the French Revolution or the calls for the abolition of slavery. They were critical of the industrial advancement of their time period, as well as the aristocracy and the various elite factions of the era. Many scholars also consider the Romantic period to be a response to the Age of Enlightenment, where ideologies surrounding reason, logic, and order were most upheld. As a result, Romantic writers like Alexander Pushkin and poets such as Byron, Keats, and Shelley needed to rebel. And this movement was not only confined to writers, composers such as Mendelssohn or Chopin, or painters such as Francisco Goya or W.M.W. Turner were also involved. They emphasized the importance of nature and the wild, expansive character of our imagination that can inform and even transcend our regular, everyday lives. Now, don't get me wrong, Alexander Pushkin was a romantic in the sentimental sense. Eugene Onegin, his most famous work, is about a bored aristocrat who rejects the affections of a woman from the countryside, and he eventually regrets it. What's eerie about this literary work is that there is a scene where Onegin is involved in a duel with another man, fatally killing him, and Pushkin himself was fatally wounded during a duel. But I'm more interested in how Pushkin's Blackness inspired his romantic side in a literary sense. About 10 years before Pushkin's tragic death, he began to write a novel in honor of his African great-grandfather titled The Blackamoor of Peter the Great. After about 30 pages, Pushkin abandons this novel, and we never know why. Yet what we have is rich because the main character named Ibrahim is not only idealized as the son of a sultan, he is as full of contradiction about his blackness as Alexander Pushkin is of his own. Ibrahim is exoticized in the midst of white European circles, not for his prominent lineage, but rather for his outward appearance. He was met with wonder at Parisian balls and suppers because people did not expect an African to be so gregarious, educated, and attractive. The same can be said for Pushkin's personal life. Though immensely talented, he stood out in school because of his prominent features that reflect African rather than Eastern European origins. Being black was an oddity in Imperial Russia, as written by Jennifer Wilson in the New York Review of Books, who was also one of my former students. I knew what it was like to be an oddity in St. Petersburg over some 200 years later. All the stares that I received, how an elder woman in a museum called me beautiful, how I evaded things being thrown at me or called monkey, or how some men oogled at me because they did not perceive me as what they imagined a black woman to look like. One Russian woman incorrectly guessed that I had family in the Caucasus region. I'm not gonna lie, as a 20-year-old at the time, I did not interrogate this kind of attention. On the contrary, I was pretty flattered by it. I liked that my presence and my body was a curious and enigmatic sight. I liked being seen as beautiful, similar to Pushkin's Ibrahim in The Blackamoor. Despite him having all the education and social aptitude that money and class could offer, he wasn't sure if the people in his midst looked upon him with a deep, respectful fondness or fetishization. If I interrogate my experience more deeply and perhaps uncomfortably, I say for me, it was the latter. Because in that one summer evening, when I had a near brush of violence with neo-Nazis, I was, as mentioned earlier, physically unscathed. What if it was because no one thought of me as black? What if I had escaped because I had escaped their conceptions of a narrow, stereotypical, and perhaps racist view of a person of African descent? This idea of being seen particularly as a black person and therefore a social outsider is also prevalent in Erika Mann's writings. From October 1927, she and her brother Claus traveled around the world as a way to escape their own troubles. She from a bad marriage and he from negative reviews on his most recent play. She spent time in both Russia and even Japan, just like myself. She documented this in a travel journal called, in English, Roundabout, The Adventure of a Journey Around the World. One of the countries where the Manns traveled is to the United States, specifically Chicago, where they encountered an intriguing person named Nora Holt. Nora Holt was a blues singer and nightclub performer in Chicago who was considered to be one of the most fascinating figures during the Harlem Renaissance, which was an era of explosive black artistic cultural production. Now, her vocation is quite interesting because of music. Blues began in the deep south of the United States, particularly in Mississippi, the blackest, by that I mean the most black people in the entire country. When black Americans were terrorized by racist white people in the deep south and oftentimes had difficulty finding stable jobs and housing for their family due to the racist infrastructure of that time, they migrated to the north in cities such as New York City, Detroit, Philadelphia, and of course, Chicago. Erika Mann describes her introduction to Nora Holt as such. Nora comports herself with the manners of a duchess. When she is introduced to a gentleman, she lowers her eyelids with the almost piqued dignity that characterizes a true lady. Only later does she become more jovial. She's a singer of most exquisite reputation. Not one of the popular type, the review queens such as Josephine Baker, she is the sensation of selected circles, a friend of international intellectual circles. She is not a true Negro. Recently, she even has had her hair straightened. For a long time, it has been dyed blonde. The procedure to straighten unmanageable hair has been invented especially for successful ladies of her race. It requires complex machines and is said to be expensive and painful. Her blonde, boyish hairdo looks provocative with her broad nose, shining eyes, and flamboyant, thick-lipped mouth. The lady who today wears her silver dress with elegant nonchalance, who makes herself up in as costly a way as any lady on Fifth Avenue, hails from New York's darkest era. The beginning is called Harlem, the Black Quarter. Nora Holt was one of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance, but she also was the first African American to receive a master's degree in music in the United States. I could talk at length about her many accomplishments, such as studying in France, composing over 200 pieces of music, writing music criticism for the Chicago Defender, which was one of the most important African American newspapers in America at the time. But according to the excerpt from Erika Mann's travelogues, Nora Holt's intrigue is not her profession, but rather her performance. Nora is said to act like royalty when she is around a male company. It's as if she is a true lady. In comparison, Josephine Baker, arguably the world's first black female superstar in history, who was born and raised in the deep south of America, is not considered a true Negro because she dyed her unmanageable hair blonde. In other words, Josephine Baker upends Erika Mann's ideas surrounding blackness, similarly to how Ibrahim Ganabal did in St. Petersburg, similar to how I did in the same place. What strikes me about Erika Mann's observations is she recognizes the arts of performance. Nora Holt is a Black American woman performing in a room full of white people. Holt knows how to perform her race in such a way to make upper-class white people comfortable in order to generate money and therefore keep her career. What also strikes me about Erika Mann's observations is about her subtle quest for cultural authenticity. Even she, as a foreigner, knew that those like Nora Holt and Josephine Baker manipulated their appearances to appear white for professional mobility and social acceptance. Erika Mann recognizes how these black female performers, eroticism and physical manipulation, pulled through from the margins to center stage. But what does it mean to be a true Negro? What does it mean to be a true African? What does it mean to be a true African American woman? I don't know for two reasons. One, race itself is a fiction with real material consequences, whether it's me running from white supremacists in St. Petersburg, Ibrahim Ganabal's capture from West Africa to Russia, Pushkin's challenge in social environment, and the vestiges of chattel slavery in America. Secondly, I don't know because as I am navigating the world in and out spaces, both domestically and internationally, I am just trying to exist. That trying, that endeavoring is what keeps me firmly rooted in my humanity. When I mean that I am just trying to exist, I'm not saying this because my health is failing, thank goodness, or that I am going through some kind of existential crisis. What I mean is that as an African American, as a Black woman, I know what it's like to undermine or escape other people's gazes because I'm not what they think a Black woman in their mind should be. I have manipulated my appearance before in order to gain white acceptance. I had chemically straightened my hair, I wore certain clothes, even changed my manner of speech so that I would not be invisible. I also graduated from the top university in my country. I speak multiple foreign languages. I've traveled the world. Everything from how I speak, dress, and look is often under scrutiny because these particular spaces were not traditionally meant for me to thrive, much less meant for me or my people at all. When I mean that I am just trying to exist, I mean that when I am under someone else's gaze, particularly a white person's, there is a power dynamic at play. Before I even had language to communicate my experience, I knew that I had to perform my beauty in such a way that made white people comfortable. I've had to move in and out of physical spaces in such a way in order to survive. And I've been trying to evade preconceived stereotypes of what I should be like because of the horrors of slaveries. Hypersexualized, demonized, masculinized, diminished, invisibilized, or erased. My body, historically, has been a contested site for colonialism, domination, and violence. In America, there is a saying, one of which I strongly disagree, that children are meant to be seen and not heard. Black women were meant to neither be seen or heard. Their original purpose in the global North was to relentlessly work and to be narrowed into existence in order to maintain social order and racial hierarchy. But what I've learned as an author, as a public thinker and speaker, is that while people are looking at me, I can look back at them. I've always been looking back at them, and this is why I call myself a romantic. I am a romantic because when I write, I do not have a third party dictating to me if my experiences are important or not. I'm used to this kind of treatment in my regular life as an African American woman who often is expected to excel better than my peers in order to get half the recognition. When I say that I'm a romantic, I not only narrativize my experiences, but I also center the emotional truth about them. Whenever I write, it is a deeply sensorial, corporal experience. I can feel a flutter or tightness in my chest, a chill down my spine, or a tear forming in my eyes, similarly to how I cried earlier today. If I write about my experiences, it means something deeply to me. When my body physically reacts to a memory that I've held within my heart from a short while or long time, it reminds me that my human existence holds multiple dimensions. I see, I hear, I smell, I taste, I touch, I wonder, I think, I question, I feel. I do not need to be strong and distant from my own passions, which is often a stereotype characterized of Black women because of the historical legacy of how much we have been forced to sacrifice for our survival. When I say that I'm a romantic writer, that means I am deeply sentimental and vulnerable, and that my emotions exist along a spectrum, each one worthy of highlighting and contextualizing. I feel soft, however. I am firmly grounded in my own body. I am the authority of my own experience and the creator of my own history as it's happening in real time. I am developing an archive where I'm speaking in and out of text where my ancestors existed on page. They only existed on page at the point of violence or their untimely deaths. And best of all, I do not need to perform within prose. I can define and redefine what it means to be myself, even as I'm learning and evolving as a person. A passage from one of Erika Mann's works was read earlier this evening, and unfortunately, I understood none of it because, ironically, I cannot understand German. However, I was given a translation prior to my arrival here in Munich, and there were a few parts that stuck out to me, and I'm going to abbreviate a bit of what she said in English. My view of the crucial issues facing modern society is more emotional than intellectual, not dogmatic, but humane. I am neither a partisan nor a crusader. My political views and actions have always been determined more by my personal experiences and impulses than by abstract principles. The only principle I adhere to is my stubborn belief in a few fundamental moral truths: truth, honor, decency, freedom, tolerance. Because I wanted to tell the truth, I had to know what was really going on in the world. I couldn't rely on other people's stories. I had to find out for myself. I had to travel around. And that's exactly what I did. Of course, all these pieces, these places, the people I met there, and the events I witnessed became an essential part of my personal history. Every new adventure, every new experience, travel, friendships, dangers, and defeats taught me something new, or rather, every new adventure confirmed, deepened, expanded one of the fundamental truths that have always guided me. She says, I don't want to develop theories, but I do want to draw conclusions from what I have seen and experienced. I have seen and experienced the ugly triumphs of brutal violence, the bankruptcy of diplomatic tricks and conventions, the suffering of decent, misguided people. But I have also seen the awakening of the victims, the rebellion of the ordinary man, his bravery, and grim determination. I found within this passage that Erika Mann, too, was also a romantic outsider. She was courageous, and that courage led her to being exiled. She emphasized the importance of personal experiences, and she was more concerned with emotions rather than intellect when it came to the undercurrents of our modern society. In the same way, so was I. I could develop theories like she did, but that's not where my deepest power resided. Instead, it was in the centering of myself in the midst of a rapidly changing world and injecting my sensitivity into all that I observed. Like her, I was not satisfied with the cataloging of others' experiences, which is why I learned Russian and multiple other languages, and that's why I traveled the world like she did. I didn't want to only read about the world, I wanted to become fully immersed in it. Every new experience did teach me something new, even the dangers, as she referenced. I escaped that ugly triumph of brutal violence that night when I was in St. Petersburg, but I experienced violence in other forms, whether it's through the devaluing of my thoughts and opinions in regular conversations, mockery and humiliation over how I looked, especially the hair that grows naturally out of my scalp, or the dismissal of my accomplishments, even as I strive to be accepted into institutions that weren't made for me. Violence, as I learned, does not only come through the might of a fist or the strength of a bullet. Violence can also come through words, sneers, gazes. Its inflicted pain can sear that psyche quite deeply, leaving no physical scars, but an ocean of emotional ones. But that's the beauty of this work. That's the beauty I found in Erika Mann's body of work, as well as Pushkin's and even my own. Each sentence, each turn of phrase has an immortal quality to it. It's to show to the world that they were here, and I was here. Because of their contribution, I realized that I was not alone, and even though my ancestors survived in places where they were considered less than human, I learned through traveling and documentation that I too was a participant in the human condition. My hope is that years later, my responsibility as a person of letters is that what has been endowed in me through others, can be endowed into someone else so that they too realize that they aren't alone. They never were, and they never will be. Thank you.